Talia Isaacs, thank you for taking time to speak to us. Let's begin with a basic question. What is pronunciation assessment?
Well, let's start by defining what we actually mean by the term pronunciation. Pronunciation refers to the way humans create speech using their articulators. This definition includes both segmental features, or individual vowel and consonant sounds, and suprasegmental features, also known as prosody, or the musical aspects of speech, such as stress, rhythm, and intonation. Pronunciation features can be measured either holistically to capture listeners' overall impressions or analyzed as separate components and independently taught and assessed.
Thank you. People often pay attention to accents when they hear someone speak. Why is that?
Well, accents are one of the most perceptually salient aspects of speech, to the extent that in research settings, listeners with no prior linguistic training have been found to be able to distinguish between native speakers and non-native speakers when listening to speech that is just 30 milliseconds long, when it's played backwards, and even when it's in a language that listeners don't understand. So listeners are highly attuned to accents. Accents are also subject to social evaluation. People routinely make informal and rather rapid judgments about how someone sounds, for example, over the phone. And in sociolinguistic experiments, listeners are asked to listen to someone's voice and then extrapolate what they hear to the talker's physical and personality attributes. For example, you might be asked in such an experiment to rate how intelligent someone is, or maybe how friendly or generous they are, or even to extrapolate physical attributes. For example, you might have a mental image in your mind of how hairy someone is based solely on how they sound, the sound of their voice.
So how pervasive is making social judgments based on speech?
Well, it's pretty ubiquitous. In fact, the earliest documented example of a language test comes from the biblical book of Judges. In that story, members of warring tribes were distinguished based on whether they pronounced the word shibboleth, which means sheaf of wheat, with a sh sound word initially, shibboleth. If they said sibboleth with a sound word initially, then they were believed to be a member of the enemy tribe, and they were instantly killed. Now, obviously, this is an extreme example with very dire consequences, but so-called shibboleth or identity tests persist in modern times. So a modern-day example is when decisions are being made about the legitimacy of an asylum seeker's claims, based often on their accent features. But such determinations are not foolproof and can actually lead to faulty conclusions based on flawed evidence or generalizations about speech patterns that aren't universal. For example, listeners' perceptions about a speaker's identity could be influenced by their stereotype views of the person's cultural group and then projected onto the speech, regardless of whether they are present in the actual speech. So the listener might assign qualities to the speech that is distorted or even absent from the actual speech sample. This potential for bias is important for language testers to be aware of.
So what does the noticeability of accents mean for teaching and assessing pronunciation?
Well, second language pronunciation teaching and research has long been governed by two contradictory principles. The first is Lewis's nativeness principle, which states that the goal of pronunciation teaching should be to sound like a native speaker, or to help learners eradicate all traces of their foreign accent. But achieving accent-free pronunciation is an unrealistic goal for most L2 learners. So we know that native-like attainment is elusive even for highly advanced learners who've achieved mastery in other language domains. In addition, having an accent free from first language influence might not be a desirable goal for learners. They may want to retain their L1 accent for identity reasons. Sounding like a native speaker also isn't necessary to integrate into a new society, achieve in academia, or succeed on the job. Barring, for example, maybe being a spy, where you need to sound like you're from those parts, or being a convincing actor, but otherwise you really don't need to sound like a native speaker. So most applied linguists subscribe to Lewis's second contrasting principle, the intelligibility principle, as the rightful goal of pronunciation instruction and assessment. This principle holds that rather than engaging in accent reduction, learners simply need to produce speech that is intelligible or easily understandable to their interlocutors. This implies that the most important features for being understood should be prioritized in pronunciation instruction and assessment. Conversely, features that are noticeable or even irritating for listeners but don't actually detract from the message should be left aside.
What are the main constructs in second language pronunciation research, and how are they measured?
Well, the nativeness principle is operationalized often by having listeners rate their perception of degree of foreign accent or accentedness. This refers to the extent to which the accent deviates from the standard language norm and would be typically measured on a numerical rating scale ranging from heavily accented to not accented at all. Now, the treatment of the intelligibility principle is a little bit more complex because the term has been defined in multivarious ways in the research literature. Derwing and Monroe's definition is pervasive, and in their interpretation of the terms, they distinguish between two closely related concepts, intelligibility and comprehensibility. Intelligibility is usually examined by measuring how many words a listener accurately understands based on their orthographic transcriptions of the speech after they hear a speech sample produced by an L2 learner. So transcription accuracy. By contrast, comprehensibility is operationalized by gauging listeners' perceived difficulty or ease of understanding an L2 utterance using a rating scale, typically a numerical scale, ranging from very easy to understand to very difficult to understand. Although this definitional distinction is usefully applied in research settings, so between intelligibility and comprehensibility, it's not clearly upheld in rating scales used in standardized speaking tests. Such scales might refer to intelligibility, when in fact what is being measured is comprehensibility or listeners' perceived understanding of the speech, if we go by Derwing and Monroe's definitions of the terms. So you could also think of intelligibility and comprehensibility in a broader sense. So I've provided you with a narrow definition of the term, that's Derwing and Monroe's operationalization of those terms, but more generally they simply refer to how easy L2 speech is to understand, and they can be used synonymously in this context. And this is often in reference to an instructional goal or an assessment target. So it's absolutely crucial to define your terms in pronunciation research.
How should we determine what to focus on in pronunciation assessment?
Well, this should be guided by the intelligibility principle. So not all errors count for the same in terms of their impact on communication, with some being more detrimental than others. For example, let's take the interdental fricative, the TH sound. So we've got a word like thing, the voiceless TH, or this, voiced. That's much less important for actually being understood. So listeners would tend to pick up on the fact that it's not pronounced accurately, but it wouldn't actually interfere with their understanding of what's being said. Conversely, the E-I distinction, for example, in a word like beat, bit, or seat, sit, is very pervasive in the English language and is an absolutely crucial distinction. So this contrast is much more important to prioritize in instruction than the intradental fricative, and also for assessment. We know that some prosodic features are very important for intelligibility. For example, features like lexical stress. And further research needs to isolate these prosodic features and examine experimentally their communicative effect on intelligibility and comprehensibility. So in classroom contexts, when trying to determine what to focus on for learners, we'd initially conduct a needs analysis to determine an instructional focus and potentially an individualized syllabus for learners. For oral production, teachers would typically first administer what's called a diagnostic passage. So this would be a read aloud text. So the learner would read aloud written text which is contrived or carefully designed to elicit a wide range of sounds in the target language that probably wouldn't come up naturally in spontaneous speech. But you'd also want to collect a spontaneous speech sample on a topic that the learner has not previously rehearsed, and then the teacher would record both of those performances, and then ideally phonemically, so do a broad phonemic transcription of both tasks. And then in determining what to target based on learner errors, ideally the teacher would take into account both the existing research evidence and what learners actually need to do in real-world settings, so in the target language use domain. It's also important to diagnose whether an inaccuracy that occurs in learners' production is due to perceptual difficulties. So it might be that the learners can't distinguish between two contrasting sounds, or if it has to do with actual articulatory effects. For example, the learner can't get the articulatory machinery in place to produce the right sound. And this can systematically be tested using discrete point items. It's also important to emphasize that pronunciation should not solely be targeted in isolation. I mean, you would use discrete point items in diagnostic assessment often, but in instruction it should be integrated with other skills, for example, fluency and vocabulary. Finally, it's useful to point out that a language like English has a terrible spelling system, very poor sound-symbol correspondence. So learners' production in a language like English could be influenced by orthography.
It strikes me that pronunciation has not been a major focus of research and practice in the field of language testing. Why is that?
Pronunciation has gone from being a focal point of language teaching and testing to being completely marginalized, with now some resurgence of interest that's been building in recent years. So when I started researching pronunciation, I came across reference to it as the Cinderella of language teaching. This was an early reference by Kelly in the 1960s. At first I thought that this was a glamorous reference to Cinderella going to the royal ball, but then realized that actually there was a discourse of neglect around pronunciation. There was reference to it being the orphan of English language teaching and suffering from the Cinderella syndrome, being excluded from the royal ball. Pronunciation has kind of been left aside in mainstream instruction, and the same is the case for assessment. So it turns out that the last book-length reference and comprehensive treatment of pronunciation was Robert Latto's 1961 book, a seminal work, Language Testing, which dedicated several chapters to the design, administration, and scoring of pronunciation items. Some ideas from Latto's book still resonate. For example, the idea of intelligible to whom, but several are really drastically out of date. For example, we know that using written multiple choice items to test pronunciation production doesn't work well. There are really serious problems with validity, so they should not be used. We should be using speaking tests to test speaking. But Latto's book really is the only existing resource on the practicalities of pronunciation assessment, and an update is urgently needed. So I really hope that there will be work on this in the coming years.
So why exactly has pronunciation been sidelined?
Well, during the communicative era, pronunciation was viewed as ineffectual or even counterproductive to fostering L2 acquisition and helping learners achieve communicative competence. So the view was that pronunciation could be learned by osmosis through exposure to comprehensible input alone, with no formal role for instruction. Another issue was that pronunciation really had an image problem and represented the worst of the mechanical audiolingual style drills, for many people. So by the late 1960s, pronunciation was dropped from the research agenda, wasn't really focused on in teaching, and also language testing was very much excluded from the mainstream, and there was hardly any work on pronunciation assessment for decades. So by the early 90s or even late 80s, there were a few isolated voices of researchers who began to advocate for the importance of pronunciation in instruction, and this is in the applied linguistics research in general. They argued that it's incumbent on teachers to address learners' pronunciation needs when it affects their intelligibility and has consequences for their communication. So we know now that the question is not whether pronunciation should be targeted in instruction, but how to do so and what is most effective. And there have been some meta-analyses on this. But we're still contending with gaps in teacher training. Many teachers are afraid of teaching pronunciation and haven't received any training in it professionally at all, so are reticent to target pronunciation and to integrate that in their classrooms. And also there is often a poor evidence base for some instructional decisions in textbooks and other pedagogical materials. So we really need a stronger evidence base in the instructional focus in resources that are available to teachers, including formative assessment. So since the mid-1990s, within applied linguistics in general, pronunciation has experienced a resurgence of interest. There's now an annual conference dedicated to pronunciation, and also the Journal of Second Language Pronunciation was recently launched. So a dedicated journal representing the maturing of the field and the integration of pronunciation increasingly into mainstream SLA in particular. Assessment research on pronunciation has been a little bit slower to pick up. Certainly it's been spurred by developments in automated assessment, but it's now increasingly gaining momentum. There are growing numbers of early career researchers doing work on pronunciation assessment, and it's an area which is inherently disciplinary, drawing on the fields of speech sciences, psycholinguistics, sociolinguistics, SLA, language pedagogy, world Englishes, lingua franca communication. So really you can get at different aspects of pronunciation from different perspectives. The field is very wide for things that need to be researched, making this a very exciting up-and-coming area within language testing.
And how should pronunciation be assessed in light of the growing use of English as a lingua franca?
Well, I noticed that you refer to the English language in your question. Most of the research to date on pronunciation assessment has been dominated by English, and we need work on all domains of pronunciation, focusing on other world languages. So some of the work really needs to focus on defining an appropriate standard of interactional or international intelligibility. What does that mean? How do we operationalize that in research studies? And also to look at phenomena such as phonological accommodation, or in interactional contexts, the convergence of speech patterns between interlocutors to establish solidarity or adjust social distance. So, for example, in paired or group speaking tests. In research settings, we've largely drawn on canned speaking tasks, so ones that tend to be quite inauthentic or mostly monologic and contrived to some extent. And we need to, I think, shift to more open-ended conversational tasks, but that can be more difficult to analyze from a research perspective. So to this point, this video is mostly focused on pronunciation as part of the L2 speaking construct. The flip side of this is listening comprehension tests, where L2 learners listen to recorded prompts of speakers, and increasingly they have different regional accents. For example, the TOEFL IBT used to only feature listening prompts of speakers of general American English. And now they also have prompts for listening comprehension from British English and Australian English speakers. But this needs to be extended to speakers of other world languages, so different L2 varieties. But the thing to keep in mind for language testers is that listener familiarity with particular accents could actually affect item difficulty in listening comprehension tests. So this is a key consideration, and as you would presume, greater familiarity would tend to make the item easier.
And lastly, what is the role of technology in pronunciation assessment?
Well, it's absolutely central. So speech is both transient and intangible, and technology is needed to render it, well, to essentially be able to record and play back speech and to actually assess it outside of live testing conditions. Technology is also needed to edit recorded speech, so you need to improve the audio quality or to extract automatically generated measures of the speech. So in order to really objectively measure pronunciation, you need to draw on technology. Now, there are fully automated tests on the market, fully automated tests of speaking. So this is where machines both deliver and score the tests, using algorithms that were trained on a large sample of human speakers and based on lots of human ratings. Pattern matching is used in actually recognizing the speech automatically, but this is most easy to do on tasks that are highly controlled and predictable, so that the machine can easily recognize the words and sounds that the learner is producing, which is quite difficult to do if they don't actually know what is being said beforehand. So segmental and durational measures really lend themselves to automatic speech recognition. But we need to be wary of machine-driven measurement. So we don't want machines dictating what we assess and teach based on what they can do well. It's important that there's some pedagogical principles that guide what we do in machine measurement as well. So we know that machines are good at measuring the accuracy of the production of consonant clusters, but some of those might be quite infrequent and not important for intelligibility, so therefore not something that should be prioritized in instruction and assessment. Conversely, features of prosody tend to be quite difficult for machines to deal with in automatic speech recognition. So this is something I think where there will be rapid improvements in the technology, but certainly the intelligibility principle is something that should not only be applied to human assessment of pronunciation, but also to machine measurement and scoring. The features that are most important for successful communication in machine scoring could actually be weighted most heavily. So with rapid advances in speech recognition technology and in the production of synthetic speech, it's likely that technology will become increasingly pervasive in our modern world. We might well already have tests where learners are communicating with avatars, and if not already, this is something that will inevitably come in the future. Of course, there are trade-offs with technology, and I think the role of pronunciation will be central to this, and there are lots of exciting possibilities to explore.